The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Richardson as Private Elena Martinez stood perfectly still in formation, her shoulders squared and eyes fixed straight ahead. What nobody in that regiment knew was that beneath her regulation uniform lay a story that would shake the very foundations of everything they believed about strength, sacrifice, and what it truly meant to serve. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena had mastered the art of becoming invisible long before she ever set foot on military soil. At 28, she possessed the kind of unremarkable presence that allowed her to blend seamlessly into any crowd, any formation, any situation where being noticed meant being targeted. Her dark brown hair was always pulled back in the same regulation style, never a strand out of place. Her uniform, though standard issue, somehow looked smaller on her petite frame, giving her the appearance of someone playing dress-up in clothes meant for someone else. The other soldiers saw what they expected to see. Another recruit struggling to keep up, another body filling a quota, another face in a sea of green that would probably wash out before completing basic training. They didn't see the way her hands remained steady during weapons training while others shook with nerves. They didn't notice how she completed obstacle courses with efficiency rather than flash, or how her eyes constantly scanned their surroundings with the awareness of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest details. Fort Richardson sprawled across 2,000 acres of Georgia pine forest, its red clay soil stained with the sweat and tears of countless soldiers who had passed through its gates. The base had trained everyone from fresh-faced 18-year-olds to seasoned officers rotating through advanced leadership courses. It was a place where reputations were built and destroyed, where the strong separated themselves from the weak, and where the pecking order was established with the brutal efficiency of a military machine. Elena's bunk sat in the corner of Barracks C, Delta Company, 2nd Platoon. The position had been assigned randomly, but she had come to appreciate its strategic value. From there, she could observe the social dynamics of her unit without drawing attention to herself. She watched as natural leaders emerged, as alliances formed and dissolved, as the inevitable conflicts arose between personalities forced to live in close quarters under constant stress. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos ran their platoon with the kind of iron discipline that had been forged through 15 years of military service. Santos was everything Elena appeared not to be. Tall, commanding, with a voice that could cut through chaos and restore order with a single word. She had served 3 tours overseas, earned commendations for valor under fire, and possessed the kind of natural authority that made even senior officers take notice when she spoke. Santos treated all her soldiers with the same demanding standard, but Elena sensed something different in the way the sergeant's eyes lingered on her during inspections. It wasn't suspicion exactly, but a kind of puzzled assessment, as if Santos was trying to solve a riddle she couldn't quite identify. Elena had learned to keep her expression neutral during these moments, offering nothing that might invite closer scrutiny. The morning routine at Fort Richardson began at 05:00 hours, with the harsh blare of reveille echoing across the barracks. Elena was always awake before the bugle sounded, a habit ingrained so deeply that she no longer needed an alarm clock. She would lie still in her bunk, listening to the groans and complaints of her bunkmates as they struggled to consciousness, and use those few minutes to prepare mentally for another day of careful performance. Physical training commenced at 05:30, and this was where Elena faced her greatest challenge. Not because she lacked fitness or endurance, but because she had to carefully calibrate her performance to appear average. Too slow, and she would draw unwanted attention from instructors. Too fast, and she would stand out among her peers, inviting questions she couldn't answer. She had learned to run in the middle of the pack, complete push-ups with adequate but not exceptional form, and navigate obstacle courses with the kind of steady competence that suggested basic proficiency rather than advanced training. Private Jessica Chen occupied the bunk next to Elena's and had appointed herself as the unofficial social coordinator for their section. Chen was barely 19, fresh out of a small town in Ohio, and possessed the kind of earnest enthusiasm that Elena envied, even as she recognized its dangers. Chen talked constantly about her plans after the military, about the college degree she would earn with her GI Bill benefits, about the family she hoped to raise in a house with a white picket fence. "You're so quiet, Martinez," Chen would say during the brief periods when they were allowed to relax in the barracks. "Where are you from? What did you do before this? Come on, share something about yourself." Elena had prepared answers for these questions. a carefully constructed background that would satisfy curiosity without revealing anything meaningful. She claimed to be from a small town in New Mexico, the daughter of a mechanic who had taught her to fix engines and change oil. She spoke of community college classes that had been interrupted by financial difficulties, of a desire to serve her country and earn stable employment. The story was bland enough to be believable, detailed enough to discourage follow-up questions. What Elena never mentioned was the 6-inch scar that ran along her left shoulder blade, hidden beneath her uniform. She never spoke of the 3 months she had spent in a military hospital, or the medals that had been presented to her family in a ceremony she was too broken to attend. Most importantly, she never revealed the real reason she had enlisted under a different name, in a different branch of service, with a background so thoroughly scrubbed that even military intelligence databases showed no trace of her previous life. The hierarchy within Delta Company was as rigid and predictable as the sunrise. At the top sat the natural athletes and alpha personalities, soldiers who had been team captains in high school and fraternity presidents in college. They commanded respect through physical prowess and social dominance, gathering followers who hoped to benefit from their reflected glory. Corporal James Mitchell embodied this archetype perfectly. At 6'3", with the kind of square-jawed good looks that belonged on recruitment posters, Mitchell had quickly established himself as the unofficial leader among the enlisted personnel. He had played football at a Division II college before a knee injury ended his athletic scholarship and led him to military service. Mitchell possessed the kind of casual confidence that came from a lifetime of being told he was special, exceptional, destined for great things. Mitchell's inner circle included Private Tommy Rodriguez, whose loyalty was purchased with protection from the kind of harassment that smaller soldiers often faced, and Private Kevin Washington, whose technical skills with communications equipment had proven valuable during training exercises. Together, they formed the core of a social network that dominated the barracks through a combination of charisma, intimidation, and strategic alliance building. Elena existed on the periphery of this social ecosystem, neither accepted into the inner circles nor actively persecuted by them. She was simply overlooked, dismissed as irrelevant to the grand drama of military hierarchy. This suited her perfectly, as visibility had become her enemy long before she ever arrived at Fort Richardson. The training schedule at the fort followed a predictable rhythm. Mornings began with physical fitness, followed by weapons training, tactical exercises, and classroom instruction on military doctrine. Afternoons were devoted to specialized skills training, field exercises, and the endless repetition of drills designed to transform civilian reflexes into military precision. Evenings offered brief periods of personal time before lights out at 2,200 hours. Elena excelled in areas where her performance couldn't be easily compared to others. Her marksmanship scores were consistently above average, but never exceptional enough to draw attention from instructors. She demonstrated competence with military equipment without revealing the depth of her familiarity with advanced systems. During classroom instruction, she answered questions when called upon, but never volunteered information that might suggest she possessed knowledge beyond what a typical recruit should have acquired. The closest call had come during a field exercise in their 3rd week of training. The scenario involved responding to a simulated ambush, and Elena's squad had found itself pinned down by instructor-operated opposing forces. The textbook response required coordinated movement under fire, with designated soldiers providing covering fire while others advanced to flanking positions. Elena had watched the exercise unfold with growing frustration, as her squadmates made tactical errors that would have been fatal in a real combat situation. Private Rodriguez had exposed himself unnecessarily while moving between cover positions. Chen had failed to maintain proper spacing during the advance. Mitchell, despite his natural leadership qualities, had focused more on appearing heroic than on executing sound tactical principles. Without thinking, Elena had begun to move, her body automatically falling into patterns of movement that had been drilled into her through months of advanced combat training. She had covered 15 meters of open ground in a low crawl that kept her invisible to the opposing forces, reaching a position where she could have easily neutralized the simulated enemy machine gun nest that was keeping her squad pinned down. The realization of what she was doing had hit her like a physical blow. Elena had forced herself to stop, to retreat back to her original position, to resume the role of confused recruit that had become her survival mechanism. The exercise had ended with her squad's defeat, marked down as a learning experience for future improvement. Staff Sergeant Santos had approached her afterward, her expression unreadable. "Interesting movement there, Martinez. Where did you learn to low crawl like that?" Elena had shrugged, keeping her voice level despite the racing of her heart. "Just seemed like the thing to do, Sergeant." Tried to stay low and avoid getting shot. Santos had studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Good instincts. Work on your team coordination next time." The incident had reminded Elena of how precarious her position truly was. Every action, every response, every moment of training was a potential exposure of the skills and knowledge she was desperately trying to hide. She had spent the following weeks being even more careful, deliberately making small mistakes to reinforce the image of a soldier still learning the basics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The social dynamics of the barracks became more complex as the weeks passed. Natural alliances formed based on shared backgrounds, complementary personalities, and mutual benefit. The soldiers from urban areas gravitated toward each other, sharing stories of city life that rural recruits couldn't relate to. College graduates formed informal study groups that helped everyone navigate the academic aspects of military training. Athletes naturally bonded over shared experiences of competition and physical achievement. Lena remained unaffiliated with any particular group, moving between them as circumstances required but never fully belonging to any. She would listen to Chen's enthusiastic plans for the future, nod politely at Mitchell's stories of athletic glory, and offer quiet assistance to soldiers struggling with equipment maintenance or academic concepts. Her role was that of the unremarkable middle ground, present but forgettable, helpful but not indispensable. The first major test of unit cohesion came during their 6th week of training with the announcement of the spring combat exercise. This would be a week-long field exercise that would test everything they had learned about tactics, teamwork, and military bearing under conditions designed to simulate the stress and confusion of actual combat operations. Staff Sergeant Santos had briefed them on the exercise parameters with her usual no-nonsense efficiency. "You will be operating in squad-sized elements across 50 square miles of training area. The scenarios will include convoy operations, checkpoint security, patrol tactics, and response to various threat situations. Your performance will be evaluated not just on individual skills, but on your ability to function as a cohesive unit." Elena had listened to the briefing with mixed emotions. Field exercises represented both opportunity and danger for her. The complex, fast-moving nature of tactical operations would provide cover for the kind of instinctive responses that might otherwise expose her background. But those same high-stress situations could also trigger muscle memory and training that would be impossible to explain away. The equipment issue for the exercise had taken place in the cavernous supply warehouse that serviced the entire training brigade. Lena had moved through the process with efficient precision, checking each item against her issued list and ensuring proper fit and function. Her familiarity with military equipment was something she couldn't entirely hide, but she tried to mask it as the kind of practical competence that came from growing up around tools and machinery. "Martinez, you seem pretty comfortable with this gear," observed Sergeant First Class David Kim, the supply NCO who was overseeing the equipment distribution. "Most recruits take twice as long to get everything sorted out." Elena had smiled politely while internally cursing her efficiency. "My dad was a mechanic, Sergeant. He always said that taking care of your tools was the first rule of any job." Kim had nodded approvingly. "Smart man. Make sure you maintain that standard in the field." The conversation had ended without further complications, but Elena had made a mental note to slow down her equipment handling in future situations. Every interaction was a potential intelligence-gathering opportunity for observers who might begin to piece together a picture that didn't match her cover story. Private Chen had struggled with the weight and complexity of her field equipment, and Elena had quietly assisted her with adjustments and load distribution without making it obvious that she possessed expertise in these areas. The help had been offered as simple common sense rather than specialized knowledge, framed as suggestions rather than instructions. "Thanks, Elena," Chen had said gratefully as they prepared to load onto the transport trucks that would carry them to the training area. "I don't know how you figured this stuff out so quickly. It's like you've done this before." The comment had been made innocently, without any suspicion or hidden meaning, but it had struck Elena like a physical blow. She had forced herself to laugh casually while arranging her equipment to hide the sudden tension in her movements. Just common sense, I guess. Everything has a purpose, so you just have to think about what makes sense. Chen had accepted the explanation without question, but Elena had spent the truck ride to the training area reviewing every interaction, every moment where her competence might have exceeded what was expected from a new recruit. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but it was the price of maintaining the anonymity that had become essential to her survival. The training area stretched across rolling hills covered in pine forest, broken by clearings that had been artificially created to simulate various tactical environments. Mock villages constructed of plywood and corrugated metal provided settings for urban warfare scenarios. Open fields offered opportunities for movement under fire exercises. Dense woods challenged navigation and concealment skills. Elena's squad had been assigned to Patrol Base Alpha, a temporary outpost constructed with sandbags, concertina wire, and camouflage netting. The base would serve as their headquarters for the week-long exercise, the central point from which they would launch missions and return for resupply and rest. The squad's composition reflected the random nature of military assignments. Besides Elena and Chen, it included Mitchell as the designated team leader, Rodriguez as the radio operator, Washington as the medic, and Private Sarah Williams, a quiet young woman from Montana whose farming background had given her an intuitive understanding of weather patterns and terrain analysis. Staff Sergeant Santos had established the ground rules with characteristic bluntness. For the next week, you are no longer trainees. You are soldiers operating in a hostile environment where mistakes have consequences. The opposing forces you will face are experienced instructors who know every trick you might try to pull. Your survival and success depend entirely on your ability to work together and apply everything you have learned. Elena had set up her individual position within the patrol base with methodical care, creating fields of fire and escape routes without making it obvious that she was applying tactical principles beyond what had been taught in their basic training. Her movements appeared random to casual observation, but they followed patterns of defensive positioning that had been drilled into her through months of advanced tactical instruction. The first mission briefing had come at 0400 hours the following morning, delivered by Santos in the dim red light that preserved night vision while allowing map reading. The assignment was a reconnaissance patrol to a suspected enemy supply depot located 3 kilometers from their base position. Intelligence suggests the depot is lightly guarded, but we don't know the exact number or disposition of enemy forces, Santos had explained, her finger tracing routes on the topographical map spread across a makeshift table. Your mission is to conduct surveillance, gather intelligence on enemy strength and activities, and report back without being detected. Mitchell had accepted the mission briefing with the kind of eager confidence that had characterized his approach to every military challenge. Elena had watched him study the map, noting how his finger traced the most direct route to the target without considering alternative approaches or contingency plans. Questions? Santos had asked. Elena had several, but asking them would require revealing knowledge of patrol tactics and reconnaissance procedures that exceeded her supposed experience level. Instead, she had remained silent, filing away her concerns for later consideration. The patrol had moved out before dawn, with Mitchell in the lead position and Elena bringing up the rear as the designated rear security. The formation was textbook, with proper spacing and overlapping fields of observation, but Elena could see tactical flaws that would have been immediately apparent to any experienced enemy force. They were moving too fast for proper noise discipline, creating a sound signature that could be detected at considerable distance. Mitchell was following predictable terrain features rather than choosing routes that offered concealment and cover. The radio checks were too frequent and too routine, establishing patterns that could be exploited by anyone monitoring their communications. Elena had wanted to suggest corrections, but doing so would have required explaining how she knew these principles. Instead, she had compensated by adjusting her own position and movement to provide better security coverage, hoping that her individual actions might offset some of the patrol's vulnerabilities. The approach to the target area had confirmed Elena's worst fears about their tactical approach. The mock enemy supply depot was located in a clearing that offered excellent observation posts for defending forces. Mitchell had led the patrol directly into the most obvious surveillance position, a small hill that overlooked the depot but also made them visible to anyone who knew where to look. Elena had recognized the tactical situation immediately. This was a classic training scenario designed to test patrol leaders' ability to conduct reconnaissance without compromising their position. The obvious vantage point was almost certainly under observation by instructor-operated opposing forces waiting to spring an ambush on overconfident students. Without breaking formation or drawing attention to herself, Elena had begun to scan the surrounding terrain for signs of defensive positions. Years of combat experience had taught her to read landscapes for indicators of human presence, disturbed vegetation, unnatural shadows, equipment reflections, and the subtle traces left by personnel who thought they were well concealed. She had spotted the first observer nest within 30 seconds of reaching the hilltop. A slight discoloration in the tree line 50 meters to their north marked the position of camouflaged instructors who were undoubtedly calling in their location to the exercise controllers. 2 more positions became apparent as her trained eyes continued their systematic scan. The patrol was walking into a carefully prepared trap, and Elena faced an impossible choice. She could maintain her cover and allow the exercise to proceed to its inevitable conclusion with their capture or elimination. Or she could take action to save her squadmates, knowing that doing so would require revealing skills and knowledge that could not be explained away. Mitchell had begun setting up his observation position with the methodical approach taught in their reconnaissance training, apparently oblivious to the fact that they were already under observation by multiple hostile positions. Rodriguez was attempting to establish radio contact with their base, transmitting in the clear without any attempt at communication security. Chen and Williams were positioned as security, but they were watching the wrong sectors and would provide no warning of the impending ambush. Elena's military training warred with her survival instincts as she watched the scenario unfold. Everything in her professional background screamed at her to take charge, to move the patrol to a defensible position, to establish proper security procedures before attempting their reconnaissance mission. But everything in her personal experience warned her that revealing such knowledge would shatter the carefully constructed anonymity that had protected her for the past 2 years. The decision was made for her when she heard the distinctive sound of movement in the brush behind their position. The opposing forces were maneuvering for a classic L-shaped ambush that would catch the patrol in a crossfire with no escape routes. In less than 2 minutes, blank ammunition would be flying and exercise controllers would be declaring her entire squad eliminated due to tactical incompetence. Elena's hand moved toward her radio, then stopped. Warning Mitchell would require explaining how she had detected the threat. Moving to a better position would expose her knowledge of small unit tactics. Any action she took would raise questions that she could not answer without destroying the fiction that had become her lifeline. Instead, she made a different choice. Elena began to shift her position gradually, as if simply adjusting her comfort level during a long observation period. Her movements were casual, unremarkable, the kind of minor fidgeting that any soldier might do during a static surveillance mission. But each adjustment placed her in a slightly better position to observe and react to the developing tactical situation. The first shots came exactly when Elena had predicted they would, erupting from 3 directions simultaneously as the instructor-operated opposing forces initiated their ambush. Blank rounds snapped through the air with the distinctive crack of simulated combat, and yellow smoke grenades burst around the patrol position to simulate artillery fire. Elena watched her squadmates react with the kind of confused panic that characterized soldiers experiencing their first taste of simulated combat. Mitchell shouted orders that contradicted each other and made no tactical sense. Rodriguez dropped his radio and reached for his weapon without remembering to call for assistance. Chen and Williams hugged the ground without returning fire or attempting to locate the source of incoming rounds. The exercise controller's whistle sounded within 30 seconds, signaling the end of the scenario. A captain emerged from the tree line carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who had just witnessed a textbook example of how not to conduct reconnaissance operations. "Gentlemen, ladies," the captain announced with professional detachment, "you are all dead. Your tactical approach was predictable, your security was non-existent, and your response to contact was completely ineffective. This scenario will be repeated tomorrow with different personnel until someone demonstrates the ability to conduct basic reconnaissance without getting their entire unit killed." Elena had listened to the critique with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated in her tactical assessment of their approach. Another part of her felt guilty for not intervening when she could have prevented the disaster. But the largest part of her felt relief that the scenario was over without requiring her to reveal capabilities that would have raised uncomfortable questions. The march back to Patrol Base Alpha had been conducted in silence, each member of the squad processing their failure in their own way. Mitchell's confidence had been visibly shaken by his first real taste of military leadership under pressure. Chen appeared close to tears, though whether from frustration or embarrassment was unclear. Rodriguez and Washington seemed stunned by how quickly everything had gone wrong. Elena had used the return journey to continue her analysis of the training area's terrain and defensive positions. Old habits died hard, and her mind automatically cataloged potential ambush sites, escape routes, and tactical advantages without conscious effort. By the time they reached their base position, she had developed a mental map of the area that would have impressed professional intelligence analysts. Staff Sergeant Santos had been waiting for them, with the kind of expression that suggested she had already received a detailed report from the exercise controller. Her briefing was characteristically direct and unforgiving. "That was about as poor a performance as I have ever witnessed," Santos had begun, her voice carrying the disappointed tone of a teacher addressing students who had failed to grasp basic concepts. "You walked into an obvious trap using an approach that would have gotten you killed in actual combat. Your security was a joke, your tactical movement was amateurish, and your response to contact was completely inadequate." Elena had stood at attention with the rest of her squad, maintaining the expression of chastened recruit while internally reviewing every moment of the failed mission. She could identify at least 12 points where different decisions would have led to success, but acknowledging any of them would require explaining knowledge that officially didn't exist. "We will repeat this exercise tomorrow," Santos had continued. "And we will continue repeating it until you demonstrate the ability to apply the tactical principles you have been taught. The opposing forces will not make it easier for you. If anything, they will increase the difficulty level until you prove that you can operate effectively under pressure." The evening had been spent in equipment maintenance and mission planning for the following day's repeat of the reconnaissance scenario. Elena had participated in the planning session, while carefully limiting her contributions to observations that any attentive soldier might make. Mitchell had struggled with the tactical concepts, his natural leadership instincts hampered by limited experience with small unit operations. Elena had wanted to suggest alternative approaches, but doing so would have required revealing familiarity with reconnaissance procedures, beyond what basic training provided. "Maybe we should try a different route," Chen had suggested during their planning session. The direct approach obviously didn't work. Elena had nodded agreement while keeping her tactical recommendations to herself. The indirect approach Chen was suggesting would indeed be more effective, but implementing it properly would require navigation and movement techniques that exceeded their supposed skill level. "The problem isn't the route," Mitchell had said with frustration evident in his voice. "The problem is that they knew we were coming. How are we supposed to conduct reconnaissance when the enemy is watching for us?" The question had highlighted the fundamental misunderstanding that was plaguing their tactical approach. Elena could have explained the principles of reconnaissance and counter-reconnaissance, the techniques for approaching target areas without detection, the importance of multiple observation positions and escape routes. But such knowledge would have immediately marked her as someone with advanced training that her background couldn't account for. Instead, she had offered a suggestion that sounded like common sense rather than tactical doctrine. "Maybe we should watch them before they watch us, figure out where they're positioned before we try to get close." The recommendation had been accepted as practical thinking rather than professional expertise, but Elena knew that implementing it effectively would require skills that none of her squadmates officially possessed. She was trapped in a situation where success demanded revealing capabilities that would destroy her cover, while failure meant watching her teammates continue to make mistakes that could have fatal consequences in actual combat. The second day's mission had proceeded with marginally better tactical awareness but still ended in simulated disaster when the patrol triggered a different ambush position during their withdrawal from the target area. Elena had identified the threat moments before the opposing forces initiated contact, but warning her teammates would have required explaining how she had detected signs of enemy presence that were invisible to less experienced eyes. The pattern had continued for 3 more days, with each iteration of the reconnaissance mission revealing new tactical challenges that tested different aspects of small unit operations. Elena had watched her squadmates gradually improve their basic skills while struggling with advanced concepts that she could have taught them in a single afternoon. By the end of the week-long exercise, Mitchell had developed rudimentary competence in patrol leadership, but his approach remained mechanical and inflexible. Chen had improved her individual soldier skills, but continued to struggle with tactical thinking under pressure. Rodriguez and Washington had become proficient at their specialized functions, but lacked the broader understanding necessary for effective teamwork. Elena had maintained her performance at exactly the level expected from a motivated but inexperienced soldier throughout the entire exercise. She had made appropriate mistakes, shown realistic improvement, and demonstrated the kind of steady competence that marked her as reliable without being exceptional. Staff Sergeant Santos had conducted the final critique with professional satisfaction at the unit's overall improvement, tempered by frustration at their continued tactical limitations. "You have shown that you can learn from your mistakes and apply basic tactical principles under pressure," Santos had concluded. "However, your performance still falls short of the standard expected from soldiers who may face actual combat operations." Elena had accepted the assessment along with her squadmates, knowing that she could have elevated their performance to professional standards if revealing her background had been an option. The exercise had been both a success and a failure. Successful in maintaining her cover, but a failure in fulfilling her desire to help her teammates reach their potential. The return to Fort Richardson had marked the end of their initial training cycle and the beginning of preparation for advanced individual training in their chosen military specialties. Elena had requested assignment to the Military Police Corps, a field that would utilize her organizational skills and attention to detail without requiring her to demonstrate the kind of specialized combat knowledge that might raise uncomfortable questions. The assignment had been approved without question, another unremarkable decision in the endless stream of personnel actions that kept the military machine functioning. Elena would report to the military police school at Fort Gordon in 2 weeks, where she would begin learning law enforcement procedures and security operations that would, ironically, utilize many of the same skills she was working so hard to conceal. As she had prepared for the transition to her next duty assignment, Elena had reflected on the weeks of training that had tested her ability to balance competence with concealment. She had successfully navigated the challenge of appearing ordinary while possessing extraordinary capabilities, but the effort had taken an emotional toll that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The constant vigilance required to monitor every action, every response, every moment of interaction was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. Elena had learned to live with the knowledge that a single moment of inattention could expose everything she had worked to hide, destroying the new life she had built from the ashes of her previous existence. But as she had packed her belongings for the journey to Fort Gordon, Elena had discovered something unexpected among her personal effects. Hidden beneath her regulation underwear and toiletries was a small card that someone had slipped into her footlocker without her knowledge. The card bore a simple message written in block letters. "Some secrets are harder to hide than others. Fort Gordon will be interesting." Elena had stared at the anonymous note with growing alarm, her mind racing through possibilities and implications. Someone had been watching her more carefully than she had realized. Someone had seen through the performance that had fooled everyone else. Someone knew that Private Elena Martinez was not what she appeared to be. The discovery had shattered her sense of security and raised questions that demanded answers she was afraid to seek. Who had been observing her so closely? How much did they know about her real background? Most importantly, what did they intend to do with whatever information they had gathered? As Elena had prepared to leave Fort Richardson, she had known that her carefully constructed anonymity was beginning to crack. The foundation of her new identity was showing stress fractures that threatened to bring down everything she had built. Fort Gordon would indeed be interesting, but not in the way she had hoped. The ghost of her previous life was beginning to stir, and Elena was no longer certain that she could keep it buried forever. Fort Gordon emerged from the Georgia heat like a mirage of red brick buildings and endless training facilities stretching across 36,000 acres of pine forest and parade grounds. Elena Martinez stepped off the transport bus with 43 other soldiers bound for the military police school, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder and her face carefully arranged in the expression of eager anticipation that was expected from new arrivals. The anonymous note from Fort Richardson remained folded in her wallet. Its ominous message burned into her memory like a brand. Someone had been watching her closely enough to detect cracks in her carefully constructed facade, and that someone had connections that extended beyond a single training facility. The realization that her secret might already be compromised had transformed every interaction into a potential threat, every casual conversation into an intelligence-gathering operation conducted by unknown adversaries. Elena's new barracks assignment placed her in Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion. a collection of buildings that housed military police students from across the country. The student population was more diverse than Fort Richardson had been, including both new recruits like herself and experienced soldiers seeking to retrain in law enforcement specialties. This mixture of experience levels would provide both opportunities and challenges for maintaining her cover. Her bunk was positioned in a 4-person room shared with Private Amanda Foster, a former college basketball player from Michigan whose athletic background had earned her fast-track consideration for the military police corps. Foster possessed the kind of natural confidence that came from years of competitive success, and her easygoing personality had already begun attracting a social circle of fellow students who gravitated toward her positive energy. Specialist Rachel Kim occupied the 3rd bunk, a quiet Korean-American woman whose previous assignment as a supply clerk had apparently failed to satisfy her ambitions for meaningful military service. Kim read constantly during off-duty hours, devouring everything from tactical manuals to philosophy texts with the intensity of someone determined to make up for lost time. Her analytical nature made Elena nervous, as Kim possessed the kind of observational skills that might detect inconsistencies in carefully prepared cover stories. The 4th member of their room was Private Lisa Thompson, whose father's 20-year career as a civilian police officer had influenced her decision to pursue military law enforcement training. Thompson carried herself with the quiet competence of someone raised around police procedures and investigative techniques. Her familiarity with law enforcement culture would make her either a valuable ally or a dangerous observer, depending on how carefully Elena managed their interactions. The academic curriculum at the military police school was more complex than basic military training had been, covering subjects that ranged from criminal investigation procedures to crowd control techniques. Elena found herself walking a familiar tightrope between demonstrating competence and avoiding expertise that would be difficult to explain. Her background had included extensive training in many of the subjects being taught, but acknowledging that knowledge would require explanations she couldn't provide. Sergeant First Class David Patterson commanded their training platoon with the kind of professional intensity that characterized career military police officers. Patterson had served tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan, earning decorations for his work in convoy security and detainee operations. His approach to instruction combined practical experience with academic rigor, creating an environment where theoretical knowledge had to be supported by real-world application. During their first week of classes, Elena carefully calibrated her performance to appear as a quick learner rather than someone with prior knowledge. She asked questions that demonstrated engagement without revealing familiarity, offered observations that showed thinking ability without exposing advanced understanding, and completed practical exercises with competence that appeared to develop naturally rather than emerge from previous training. The challenge became more complex during defensive tactics instruction, where muscle memory threatened to betray years of advanced combat training. Elena had learned hand-to-hand combat techniques far beyond what military police students were expected to master, but demonstrating those skills would immediately mark her as someone with specialized background that her personnel file couldn't account for. Instructor Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez ran the Defensive Tactics program, with emphasis on practical techniques that military police might need during detention operations or crowd control situations. The training covered basic strikes, holds, and restraint procedures that were designed to control suspects without causing unnecessary injury. For most students, these techniques represented their first exposure to formal combat training beyond basic military self-defense. Elena participated in the training while carefully limiting her responses to what an intelligent but inexperienced student might display. When practicing with training partners, she focused on form and technique rather than speed or effectiveness. During demonstration exercises, she made appropriate mistakes and showed realistic improvement rather than the kind of instant mastery that would have been natural for someone with her background. The effort required constant vigilance and self-control that was mentally exhausting in ways that actual combat had never been. Elena found herself overthinking every movement, analyzing every response, second-guessing every decision to ensure that her performance remained within acceptable parameters. The stress of maintaining this careful facade was beginning to show in subtle ways that she hoped weren't visible to her observers. Amanda Foster proved to be a natural training partner, whose athletic background gave her quick reflexes and good body awareness, but whose lack of formal combat training made her a safe practice opponent. Foster's enthusiasm for learning meant that she focused on her own development rather than analyzing Elena's performance, creating a comfortable dynamic that allowed Elena to blend into the group without drawing attention. Specialist Kim presented a different challenge, as her analytical nature led her to study everyone's techniques with the intensity of someone conducting research. Elena caught Kim watching her during training sessions, noting her form and movement patterns with the kind of attention that suggested more than casual interest. Whether Kim was simply curious about different learning styles or suspected something deeper remained unclear, but Elena made mental notes to be especially careful when Kim was observing. The academic coursework covered subjects that included criminal law, evidence collection, report writing, and courtroom testimony procedures. Elena's previous experience had included extensive training in many of these areas, but from a different perspective that emphasized intelligence gathering rather than law enforcement. She had to carefully adapt her knowledge to fit the military police context, while avoiding references to training or experiences that weren't part of her official background. Constitutional law presented particular challenges, as Elena's understanding of Fourth Amendment protections and legal procedures was far more sophisticated than a typical new recruit should possess. She found herself editing her contributions to class discussions, offering simplified observations rather than the nuanced analysis that came naturally from years of advanced training in surveillance and investigation techniques. Sergeant Patterson's teaching style encouraged student participation through case study analysis and scenario-based problem-solving. Elena participated actively but carefully, demonstrating logical thinking without revealing specialized knowledge. Her contributions were well received by instructors and fellow students, establishing her reputation as a serious student without crossing the line into exceptional performance that might invite unwanted scrutiny. The practical training exercises became increasingly complex as the course progressed, incorporating scenarios that tested students' ability to apply classroom learning to realistic situations. Elena found these exercises both exhilarating and terrifying, as they provided opportunities to use her skills while threatening to expose capabilities that exceeded her supposed experience level. A simulated domestic violence call during their third week of training had presented exactly this kind of challenge. The scenario involved responding to a report of an armed suspect who had barricaded himself in a residence with multiple family members. Students were required to establish a security perimeter, attempt communication with the suspect, and coordinate with simulated backup units while protecting civilian safety. Elena's team had been assigned the role of first responding unit, with Foster as team leader and Kim providing communications support. The exercise had begun conventionally, with proper tactical approach and establishment of cover positions around the mock residence. But when the simulated suspect had opened fire with blank ammunition, the scenario had quickly escalated beyond the team's training level. Foster had frozen under the pressure of simulated combat, her athletic confidence evaporating when faced with tactical decisions that had no clear answers. Kim had maintained radio contact with exercise controllers, but had failed to provide the kind of tactical information that would have been essential in an actual emergency. The third team member, Private Johnson, had taken cover and returned fire, but had failed to consider civilian safety or coordinate his actions with his teammates. Elena had watched the scenario deteriorate while fighting every instinct that screamed at her to take charge of the situation. Her training had included extensive experience with exactly this type of crisis response, from hostage rescue operations to urban combat in civilian areas. She could have resolved the exercise in minutes, using techniques that had been drilled into her through months of specialized instruction. Instead, she had maintained her assigned position and provided support that appeared to come from common sense rather than tactical expertise. Elena had suggested communication approaches that might calm the situation, pointed out civilian safety concerns that others had missed, and provided covering fire that protected her teammates without demonstrating advanced marksmanship skills. The exercise had ended with a negotiated surrender that satisfied the training objectives, while avoiding the kind of spectacular success that would have drawn unwanted attention. Elena's contributions had been noted as examples of good teamwork and situational awareness, praise that acknowledged her participation without suggesting exceptional capabilities. Sergeant Patterson's critique had focused on leadership under pressure and the importance of maintaining tactical discipline during crisis situations. Real emergency calls don't follow textbook scenarios, Patterson had explained to the assembled students. The ability to adapt your training to unexpected situations while maintaining focus on your primary objectives is what separates effective military police officers from those who become casualties or cause civilian harm. Elena had listened to the critique while reviewing her own performance for signs of exposure. Her suggestions had been appropriate for someone with her supposed background, her tactical actions had remained within expected parameters, and her overall contribution had appeared to emerge from intelligent analysis rather than prior experience. The exercise had been another successful navigation of the narrow path between competence and revelation, but the constant pressure of this performance was taking an emotional toll that Elena was finding increasingly difficult to manage. Every training scenario forced her to watch teammates make mistakes that she could easily correct, to remain silent when her knowledge could prevent simulated disasters, to accept less effective solutions when better alternatives were obvious to her experienced eye. The frustration was compounded by the growing certainty that someone at Fort Gordon was conducting the same kind of surveillance that had produced the anonymous note at Fort Richardson. Elena had begun noticing patterns of observation that suggested coordinated intelligence gathering rather than casual interest. Instructors seemed to pay particular attention to her responses during training scenarios. Administrative personnel asked questions about her background that went beyond routine processing requirements. Fellow students initiated conversations that felt more like interviews than social interactions. The breakthrough in understanding came during their 4th week of training, when Elena discovered Specialist Kim conducting what appeared to be a systematic review of student personnel files in the company administration office. Kim had been assigned to assist with filing and record maintenance as part of her additional duties, a position that provided access to exactly the kind of information that someone conducting background investigations would need. Elena had observed Kim's activities during her own visit to the administration office to update her emergency contact information. Kim's approach to the filing task suggested familiarity with intelligence analysis procedures rather than simple clerical work. She was making notes on a separate pad while reviewing files, cross-referencing information in ways that indicated she was looking for patterns or inconsistencies rather than simply organizing documents. The realization that Kim might be conducting surveillance had forced Elena to completely reassess her security situation. If Kim was working for whoever had been watching her at Fort Richardson, then her cover might already be compromised beyond repair. But if Kim was conducting her own investigation for personal reasons, then there might still be opportunities to manage the situation without exposing her true background. Elena had decided to test Kim's intentions through a carefully planned approach that would provide information about Kim's knowledge and objectives without revealing her own concerns. The opportunity had come during a study session in their barracks room, when Kim had made casual conversation about their fellow students' backgrounds and qualifications. "It's interesting how diverse everyone's experience is," Kim had observed while reviewing notes from their criminal law class. Foster's athletic background gives her great physical skills, but she struggles with the academic side. Thompson's police family background makes her natural at procedural stuff. "You seem to pick up everything pretty quickly, considering you don't have any prior law enforcement exposure." Elena had recognized the comment as a probe designed to elicit information about her background and qualifications. Kim's approach was subtle but professional, suggesting training in interrogation or intelligence gathering techniques that exceeded what a supply clerk should have acquired through normal military service. "I guess I'm just good at applying things I've learned in other contexts," Elena had replied carefully. "My dad always said that most problems have similar solutions once you understand the underlying principles." Kim had nodded thoughtfully, her expression suggesting that Elena's response had been noted and would be analyzed later. "That's a very mature way of looking at learning. Most people our age don't think that systematically about knowledge transfer." The exchange had confirmed Elena's suspicions that Kim was conducting some form of investigation into her background and capabilities. But it had also suggested that Kim's approach was indirect and cautious, indicating that she didn't yet have definitive evidence of Elena's true identity. Elena had begun implementing counter-surveillance measures, designed to determine the scope and nature of Kim's activities without alerting her to the fact that she had been detected. These measures had to be subtle enough to appear like normal behavior while providing information about Kim's methods and connections. The first step had been to establish patterns of behavior that would make it obvious if Kim was conducting systematic observation. Elena had begun varying her routine in small ways that would be invisible to casual observers, but would force anyone conducting surveillance to adjust their own activities in detectable ways. She changed her study locations, altered her exercise schedule, and modified her social interactions in patterns that would reveal whether Kim was tracking her movements. The results had been illuminating and disturbing. Kim's behavior had adjusted to Elena's routine changes in ways that confirmed systematic surveillance. But more concerning was the discovery that Kim wasn't working alone. Elena had identified at least 2 other students who were coordinating their activities with Kim's observations, creating a surveillance network that suggested serious organizational backing. Private Thompson had proven to be one of Kim's collaborators, using her access to training scenarios and administrative information to provide data about Elena's performance and reactions. Thompson's police family background had given her natural cover for asking detailed questions about procedures and protocols, questions that Elena now realized were designed to test her knowledge rather than satisfy curiosity. The second collaborator was more surprising: Amanda Foster, whose friendly personality and athletic focus had provided perfect camouflage for observation activities. Foster's social connections gave her access to informal information about student backgrounds and opinions, intelligence that was clearly being passed along to whoever was coordinating the surveillance operation. Elena's discovery that her 3 roommates were all involved in monitoring her activities had been a devastating blow to her sense of security. The realization that she had been placed in a room with trained observers rather than random assignment had suggested a level of planning and resources that went far beyond casual interest. Someone with significant authority and capabilities was investing serious effort in determining her true identity and background. The question of why this investigation was taking place had multiple possible answers, none of them reassuring. Elena's previous life had involved classified operations and sensitive assignments that could have created enemies or attracted attention from various intelligence services. Alternatively, someone might have connected her current identity to her previous one and was gathering evidence for prosecution or blackmail purposes. Most disturbingly, the investigation might be connected to the events that had forced her to abandon her previous identity in the first place. Elena had assumed that her careful disappearance and identity change had closed that chapter of her life permanently, but the discovery of systematic surveillance suggested that some threads from her past were still active and dangerous. Elena had realized that she needed to take decisive action to determine the nature and scope of the threat she was facing. Passive counter-surveillance was providing valuable information, but it wasn't revealing the ultimate source or objective of the investigation. She needed to force her watchers to reveal their hand while maintaining her cover and protecting her new identity. The opportunity had come during a field training exercise that took their class to the Fort Gordon training areas for a week-long practical application of their classroom learning. The exercise would involve multiple scenarios that tested their ability to conduct military police operations under realistic conditions, providing perfect cover for the kind of direct action that Elena needed to take. Elena had volunteered for additional duties during the exercise preparation, positioning herself to access information about surveillance activities while appearing to focus on training requirements. Her reputation as a serious student and reliable soldier had made the volunteer assignment unremarkable, providing legitimate reasons for her to interact with instructors and administrative personnel who might have information about the investigation. The breakthrough had come when Elena had discovered a classified communication in the exercise command post that contained references to Subject Martinez and authorization for enhanced observation protocols. The document had been brief and heavily redacted, but it had confirmed that her surveillance was being conducted under official authority and was focused specifically on determining her true background and capabilities. More importantly, the document had revealed that the investigation was being conducted by the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, suggesting that someone suspected her of criminal activity or security violations, rather than simple background irregularities. This revelation had forced Elena to completely reassess her situation and consider options that she had hoped never to use. The CID investigation explained the professional quality of the surveillance and the resources being devoted to determining her identity. It also suggested that whoever had initiated the investigation had access to information that connected her current identity to her previous life, despite all the precautions she had taken to sever those connections. Elena had realized that her time at Fort Gordon was likely to end with exposure and arrest unless she took immediate action to protect herself. The question was whether to disappear again and create another new identity, or to confront the investigation directly and attempt to resolve whatever charges or suspicions had triggered the surveillance. The decision had been made for her when she had discovered that the investigation was scheduled to conclude with her arrest during the final week of military police training. The classified documents had indicated that CID agents were planning to take her into custody on charges related to her previous identity, charges that Elena knew were based on false information and manufactured evidence that had destroyed her original life. Elena had understood that running away would only confirm the investigators' suspicions and would likely result in a manhunt that would make creating another new identity impossible. But staying and fighting the charges would require revealing her true background and reliving the events that had forced her into hiding in the first place. The choice between flight and confrontation had been agonizing, but Elena had ultimately decided that she was tired of running from lies and accusations that had already stolen too much of her life. If CID wanted to investigate her background, she would give them the full truth and force them to confront the real criminals who had escaped justice while she lived in exile. But first, she needed to gather evidence that would support her version of events and protect her from the kind of frame-up that had destroyed her previous life. Elena had begun documenting everything she could discover about the investigation, creating a record that would serve as insurance against false accusations and manufactured evidence. The process had required taking risks that could have exposed her immediately if her surveillance team had been more competent. Elena had used her access to the command post to photograph documents, copy files, and gather intelligence about the scope and nature of the charges being prepared against her. Each action had been carefully planned to appear routine while providing maximum intelligence value. Elena had also begun reaching out to contacts from her previous life, people who knew the truth about what had happened and might be willing to testify on her behalf if the situation escalated to formal proceedings. These communications had to be conducted with extreme caution, as they risked exposing both herself and her contacts to retaliation from the same forces that had destroyed her original career. The response from her former colleagues had been mixed but encouraging. Several had confirmed that they had suspected the truth about her supposed crimes and would be willing to provide testimony if given official protection. Others had warned her that the investigation was more dangerous than she realized, involving corruption that extended to the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Most importantly, Elena had learned that she was not the only victim of the conspiracy that had destroyed her previous life. Several other soldiers and civilians had been falsely accused and prosecuted on manufactured evidence, creating a pattern of abuse that was finally attracting attention from legitimate investigators. This revelation had given Elena hope that confronting her accusers might finally lead to justice rather than simply exchanging one form of persecution for another. But it had also made clear that the stakes were much higher than her personal freedom, as her case could potentially expose a network of corruption that had destroyed multiple lives and careers. Elena had realized that her decision about how to handle the CID investigation would affect not only her own future, but also the possibility of justice for other victims of the same conspiracy. The weight of that responsibility had been both terrifying and liberating, as it had given her a purpose beyond simple survival. As the field training exercise had approached, Elena had finalized her preparations for what she knew would be the climactic confrontation of her new life. She had gathered evidence, contacted witnesses, and prepared for the possibility that her next few days would determine whether she would spend the rest of her life in prison or finally achieve the vindication that had been stolen from her years ago. The one element of the situation that remained a mystery was the role of her roommates in the investigation. Elena still wasn't certain whether Kim, Thompson, and Foster were working directly for CID, or were simply students who had been recruited to provide information about her activities. Their ultimate loyalties would likely determine whether she faced the investigation alone or with unexpected allies. Elena had decided to force that question during the field exercise by creating a situation that would require her watchers to reveal their true allegiances. The plan was risky and could backfire spectacularly, but Elena was tired of being the subject of investigation rather than the agent of her own destiny. The field training exercise was about to begin, and Elena Martinez was finally ready to stop hiding from her past and start fighting for her future. The ghost of her previous life was about to emerge from the shadows, and this time she was prepared for battle. The Georgia dawn broke through morning mist as Elena Martinez stood with 200 other military police students in the largest formation of her training cycle. Colonel Michael Hawkins commanded the ceremony from a raised platform, his chest heavy with ribbons that spoke of 3 decades of distinguished service. Behind him sat a panel of distinguished visitors, including a congressman, 2 general officers, and representatives from various law enforcement agencies who had come to observe the culmination of the military police training program. Elena maintained perfect military bearing while her pulse hammered against her collar. This was the moment she had been both dreading and anticipating for weeks. The field training exercise had ended 3 days ago, with her performance carefully calibrated to appear competent but unremarkable. Another successful navigation of the narrow path between excellence and exposure. But intelligence she had gathered suggested that today's ceremony would serve as more than a simple graduation celebration. The classified documents she had photographed revealed that CID planned to arrest her immediately following the formation, timing the action to maximize humiliation, while minimizing the risk of escape or resistance. Elena's supposed crimes would be announced publicly, her false identity exposed, and her carefully constructed new life destroyed in front of cameras and witnesses, who would ensure that her disgrace received maximum publicity. But Elena had spent the past 72 hours implementing a plan that would turn their ambush into something entirely different. Hidden beneath her dress blue uniform was evidence that would expose the conspiracy that had destroyed her previous life and reveal the truth that powerful people had spent years trying to bury. More importantly, she had identified allies among the distinguished visitors who possessed both the authority and motivation to ensure that justice would finally be served. General Patricia Williams sat in the second row of distinguished guests, her presence officially explained as routine oversight of military police training programs. But Elena knew that Williams had been conducting her own investigation into the corruption that had destroyed multiple military careers, and that Williams had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity to force the truth into public light. Colonel Hawkins began the ceremony with remarks about duty, honor, and the sacred trust placed in military police officers who served as guardians of military justice. His words carried bitter irony for Elena, who had spent months documenting how thoroughly that trust had been betrayed by the very people who spoke most eloquently about its importance. The formation stood at rigid attention, while Hawkins droned through prepared remarks about military values and professional excellence. Elena used the time to scan the assembled crowd, identifying CID agents positioned around the periphery and noting their tactical arrangements. Agent Sarah Mitchell stood near the reviewing stand with her hand positioned to quickly access the handcuffs concealed beneath her jacket. Agent Robert Chen had positioned himself to block the most direct escape route from the formation. Agent Lisa Rodriguez maintained overwatch from an elevated position that would allow her to coordinate the arrest operation. But Elena had also identified unexpected elements in the crowd that suggested her counter-operation was proceeding according to plan. Major James Patterson, her former commanding officer from her previous life, stood among the visitors wearing civilian clothes and the carefully neutral expression of someone prepared to deliver devastating testimony. Captain Maria Santos, who had witnessed the events that led to Elena's false conviction, had traveled from her current assignment to serve as a witness to the truth that had been buried for so long. Most importantly, Elena had spotted Agent David Kim from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, whose presence indicated that federal investigators were finally taking action against the network of officials who had perverted military justice for personal and political gain. Kim's investigation had been proceeding in parallel with CID's pursuit of Elena, but with entirely different objectives and conclusions. The ceremony proceeded through its formal elements with military precision. Awards were presented to distinguished graduates, speeches were delivered by visiting dignitaries, and the assembled students demonstrated their newly acquired skills through tactical demonstrations and ceremonial drill performances. Elena participated in each element while maintaining awareness of the tactical situation developing around her. Specialist Rachel Kim stood 3 positions to Elena's left in the formation, her posture perfect, but her expression betraying tension that had nothing to do with ceremonial pressure. Over the past week, Elena had begun to suspect that Kim's surveillance activities were more complex than simple CID cooperation. Evidence suggested that Kim might be working for competing investigation teams, gathering intelligence that would be used against the same CID agents who thought they were controlling her activities. Private Amanda Foster occupied the position directly behind Elena, close enough to provide physical support if the situation deteriorated into chaos. Foster's athletic reflexes and competitive instincts had made her a natural choice for Elena's emergency backup plan, though Foster's exact role in the broader investigation remained unclear even to Elena herself. Private Lisa Thompson stood at the far end of their row, positioned to observe the crowd and provide early warning of tactical developments that might threaten their operation. Thompson's police family background had given her natural skills for surveillance and threat assessment that complemented Elena's military training in ways that had proved invaluable during their planning sessions. The moment of truth arrived when Colonel Hawkins announced that the ceremony would conclude with recognition of students who had demonstrated exceptional performance during their training cycle. Elena's name was called third in the sequence, requiring her to step forward and march to the reviewing stand where she would receive a certificate of achievement and public recognition for her academic and practical accomplishments. Elena executed the required movements with parade ground precision, her polished boots clicking against concrete as she approached the reviewing stand. Every step carried her closer to the confrontation that would determine whether she spent the next decade in federal prison or finally achieved justice for the crimes committed against her and others. Agent Mitchell tensed as Elena approached the platform, her hand moving toward the handcuffs while her eyes scanned for backup from her fellow agents. But Elena had timed her countermove to coincide with maximum public exposure and minimum opportunity for suppression or cover-up. Colonel Hawkins extended his hand to congratulate Elena on her training achievements, and Elena grasped it firmly while speaking in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of the assembled crowd. "Thank you, sir, but I need to address a matter of urgent importance to military justice and national security." The colonel's expression shifted from ceremonial formality to confused concern as Elena continued speaking without releasing his hand. "My name is not Elena Martinez. I am Captain Sarah Elizabeth Torres, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment, and I am here to expose a conspiracy that has perverted military justice and destroyed the lives of innocent soldiers for the personal gain of corrupt officials." The revelation struck the formation like a physical blow, rippling through the ranks as students processed the impossible transformation of their unremarkable classmate into someone claiming to be a decorated special operations officer. Cameras that had been recording routine ceremonies suddenly focused with laser intensity on the unfolding drama. Agent Mitchell moved toward the platform with her credentials visible and handcuffs ready, but her advance was blocked by General Williams, who had risen from her seat with the unmistakable authority of someone taking control of a developing situation. "Agent Mitchell, you will stand down immediately," Williams commanded, her voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that brooked no argument. "This ceremony is now under federal investigation oversight, and any attempt to interfere with these proceedings will be considered obstruction of justice." Elena released Colonel Hawkins' hand and turned to face the assembled crowd, knowing that this moment would determine whether truth or corruption would prevail in the confrontation that had been building for years. Her voice carried clearly across the formation as she began to speak. "For the past 3 years, I have lived under a false identity after being convicted of war crimes that I did not commit. The evidence against me was manufactured by Colonel Vincent Kruger and his network of corrupt officials who sold classified information to enemy forces and used innocent soldiers as scapegoats to cover their crimes." The crowd's reaction was immediate and intense, with conversations erupting throughout the formation as people processed the magnitude of the accusations being made. Elena continued speaking over the noise, determined to deliver her complete testimony before anyone could silence her. Colonel Kruger and his associates framed multiple soldiers for their own crimes, destroying careers and lives to protect a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. "I am here today to present evidence that will prove the innocence of everyone who was falsely convicted and expose the real criminals who have escaped justice for too long." Agent Mitchell made another attempt to approach the platform but found her path blocked by Major Patterson, who had positioned himself to protect Elena while she delivered her testimony. Patterson's presence as a witness gave Elena's accusations credibility that would have been impossible to achieve through her individual testimony alone. General Williams stepped forward to address the crowd, her voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are witnessing is the culmination of a federal investigation into corruption within military justice systems. Captain Torres has been working undercover to gather evidence that has already resulted in the arrest of 17 officials on charges ranging from treason to conspiracy to commit murder." Elena felt a surge of vindication as Williams' words confirmed that the investigation had proceeded far beyond her individual case. The network of corruption that had destroyed her life was finally being exposed and dismantled, with consequences that would extend throughout the military and civilian leadership structures that had enabled it. But the confrontation was far from over. Elena knew that the evidence she carried could provide the final pieces necessary to complete the prosecution of officials who had thought themselves beyond the reach of justice. More importantly, She needed to ensure that her testimony would be preserved and protected against the kind of suppression that had buried the truth for so long. Elena reached into her dress blue jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope containing copies of the classified documents she had gathered during her investigation. The envelope also contained testimony from witnesses who had been afraid to speak publicly until federal protection could be guaranteed. General Williams, I am prepared to provide complete testimony and evidence regarding the crimes committed by Colonel Kruger's network, but I request that this testimony be delivered in a public forum, where it cannot be suppressed or classified to protect the guilty parties. Williams accepted the envelope with the solemnity appropriate to a moment that would reshape military justice. Captain Torres, your courage in gathering this evidence while maintaining your cover has made it possible to achieve justice that would otherwise have been impossible. The American people deserve to know the full extent of the corruption that has been exposed through your sacrifice. The formal ceremony had dissolved into chaos as students, instructors, and visitors processed the dramatic revelations unfolding before them. Elena remained at attention on the reviewing platform, maintaining military bearing while understanding that her 3-year ordeal of false identity and hidden truth was finally approaching its conclusion. Agent Chen approached the platform with a completely different demeanor than his fellow CID agents, his credentials identifying him as part of the federal investigation rather than the corrupt network that had been pursuing Elena. Captain Torres, I am Agent Chen with the FBI Public Corruption Unit. We have been coordinating with General Williams to ensure your safety during this operation. Are you prepared to provide formal testimony regarding the evidence you have gathered? Elena nodded her acceptance while scanning the crowd for signs that corrupt officials might attempt to interfere with the proceedings. The presence of cameras and witnesses would make it difficult for anyone to suppress her testimony, but Elena had learned never to underestimate the lengths that desperate people would go to protect themselves. The transformation in how people viewed her was visible and immediate. Students who had dismissed her as unremarkable were now staring with the kind of awe reserved for heroes who had achieved the impossible. Instructors who had evaluated her performance were reconsidering every interaction in light of her revealed identity. Even the distinguished visitors were processing the implications of having witnessed what might become one of the most significant military corruption exposures in decades. Specialist Kim approached the platform with an expression that combined relief with professional satisfaction. Captain Torres, I should inform you that I have been working with federal investigators throughout your time at Fort Gordon. My surveillance was designed to protect you from corrupt CID agents while gathering evidence about their activities. Elena studied Kim's face for signs of deception, but found only the honest relief of someone whose long and difficult assignment was finally approaching successful completion. Kim's revelation explained many of the inconsistencies that Elena had observed in the surveillance activities, suggesting that multiple investigation teams had been operating simultaneously with different objectives and loyalties. Private Foster stepped forward from the formation with the confidence that had characterized her athletic career. Ma'am, I was also part of the protective surveillance team. My job was to ensure that you remained safe while gathering evidence about corrupt officials who might attempt to silence you before your testimony could be delivered. Elena realized that her paranoia about being watched had been both justified and misdirected. She had been under surveillance, but by investigators working to protect her rather than corrupt officials working to destroy her. The investigation had been far more complex and far-reaching than she had understood, involving coordination between federal agencies and military commands that had required years of careful planning. Private Thompson approached with the serious expression of someone delivering important information. Captain, my father's police department has been cooperating with federal investigators to trace the civilian connections to the military corruption network. Your evidence will help complete prosecutions that extend far beyond military personnel. Elena felt the weight of responsibility that came with understanding the full scope of what her testimony could accomplish. Her individual case was important, but it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle that involved corruption affecting both military and civilian law enforcement at multiple levels of government. General Williams returned to the platform with documents that appeared to be official orders and authorizations. Captain Torres, I am pleased to inform you that your conviction has been overturned and your commission has been restored with full back pay and benefits. More importantly, you are hereby assigned to my personal staff with responsibility for ensuring that the reforms necessary to prevent future corruption are properly implemented. Elena accepted the documents while struggling to process the magnitude of the transformation that had occurred in her life over the course of a single ceremony. 3 hours earlier, she had been Private Elena Martinez, living under false identity and facing arrest on manufactured charges. Now she was Captain Sarah Torres again, vindicated and restored to the military career that had been stolen from her through lies and conspiracy. But vindication brought its own challenges and responsibilities. Elena understood that her restoration was only the beginning of a process that would require years of effort to complete. The evidence she had gathered would be used in prosecutions that would reshape military justice, but those prosecutions would also expose her to retaliation from officials who had not yet been arrested or removed from positions of authority. Colonel Hawkins approached with the expression of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged by the morning's revelations. "Captain Torres, I apologize for any role that my command may have played in perpetuating the injustices you have suffered. I am prepared to provide whatever cooperation is necessary to ensure that truth and justice prevail." Elena recognized that Hawkins was likely innocent of direct involvement in the corruption, but that his position required him to acknowledge institutional failures that had enabled the conspiracy to operate for so long. His willingness to accept responsibility and commit to reform was encouraging, but Elena knew that real change would require sustained effort over many years. The media representatives who had come to cover a routine training graduation were now documenting what would become a major national news story. Elena understood that her exposure to public attention would bring both benefits and risks, as publicity would make it difficult for corrupt officials to retaliate against her, but would also make it impossible for her to return to the anonymity that had protected her for 3 years. Agent Kim from the FBI approached with additional federal investigators who would be responsible for processing the evidence Elena had gathered and coordinating her testimony in the prosecutions that were already underway. "Captain Torres, we have prepared secure facilities where you can provide detailed testimony about everything you witnessed and documented. Your safety will be our primary concern throughout this process." Elena nodded her acceptance while understanding that her cooperation with federal investigators would likely require months of intensive debriefing and testimony preparation. The evidence she had gathered was complex and far-reaching, involving crimes that had occurred over several years and affected multiple victims who would need justice and vindication. The formation of military police students remained at attention throughout the dramatic proceedings, their training in military discipline allowing them to maintain composure despite witnessing events that would be remembered as historic. Elena looked out at her fellow students and recognized that they were observing a demonstration of the military values they had been trained to uphold: courage in the face of injustice, integrity in the pursuit of truth, and commitment to protecting the innocent regardless of personal cost. Elena's dress blue uniform bore the same ribbons and decorations it had carried 3 hours earlier, but their meaning had been completely transformed by the restoration of her true identity. The ribbons that had seemed like costume jewelry on Private Martinez now represented genuine achievements earned through courage and sacrifice by Captain Torres. Most importantly, Elena realized that she no longer needed to hide the skills and knowledge that had made her such an effective soldier and investigator. The constant vigilance required to appear average while possessing exceptional capabilities had been exhausting in ways that actual combat had never been. For the first time in 3 years, Elena could be herself completely and openly. General Williams concluded the transform ceremony with remarks that addressed both the immediate situation and the broader implications for military justice reform. "Today we have witnessed proof that truth and justice will ultimately prevail over corruption and conspiracy, regardless of how powerful the perpetrators believe themselves to be. Captain Torres's courage in maintaining her investigation while living under false identity has made it possible to achieve justice that appeared impossible just hours ago." Elena stepped down from the reviewing platform as Captain Sarah Torres for the first time in 3 years, her true identity restored and her military career vindicated through evidence that would reshape how the military addressed corruption within its own ranks. The graduation ceremony had become something far more significant, a public demonstration that no one was beyond the reach of justice when courageous individuals were willing to sacrifice their personal safety for the greater good. The crowd began to disperse as students and visitors processed the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Elena found herself surrounded by federal investigators, military officials, and media representatives who would play important roles in the next phase of her life. But for the first time since her original conviction, Elena faced the future with confidence rather than fear. Her 3-year ordeal of false identity and hidden truth was finally over, but her work to ensure justice and reform was just beginning. Captain Sarah Torres was ready to resume the military career that had been stolen from her, and to use her experience to ensure that no other soldier would suffer the injustices that had driven her into exile. The morning sun climbed higher over Fort Gordon as Elena walked away from the reviewing stand, no longer hiding in plain sight but standing proudly in the light of truth and vindication. The ghost of Private Martinez faded into memory, replaced by the living reality of Captain Torres, and the promise of justice finally served. Agent Chen approached Elena as she prepared to leave with the federal investigation team. "Captain, there's one more element of this operation that you should know about. The evidence you gathered has been coordinated with similar investigations at military installations across the country. Your courage in maintaining your cover and gathering intelligence has made it possible to expose corruption that extends far beyond the officials who destroyed your original career." Elena listened with growing understanding of how her individual case had become part of something much larger and more significant. Her suffering had not been in vain if it could prevent others from experiencing similar injustices, and if it could restore integrity to military justice systems that had been perverted by corruption and personal ambition. "How many other victims were there?" Elena asked, though she suspected the answer would be both larger and more disturbing than she was prepared to hear. Chen's expression was grim but determined. "We have identified 47 soldiers and civilians who were falsely convicted or destroyed through manufactured evidence over the past 8 years. Your testimony will be crucial in achieving justice for all of them and ensuring that the officials responsible face appropriate consequences." Elena felt the weight of responsibility that came with representing so many victims of the same conspiracy that had destroyed her own life. But she also felt the satisfaction of knowing that her 3 years of exile and investigation had made it possible to achieve justice on a scale that would have been impossible through individual action. As Elena prepared to begin the next chapter of her life as a federal witness and restored military officer, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the depths of false conviction to the heights of vindication and justice. The road ahead would be challenging, but Elena faced it with the confidence that came from knowing she had survived the worst that corruption and conspiracy could inflict and had emerged stronger and more determined than ever. The formation at Fort Gordon had indeed silenced an entire regiment, but not through shame or humiliation as her enemies had intended. Instead, it had silenced them through the awesome power of truth finally revealed, and justice finally served. Captain Sarah Torres was ready to ensure that power would be used to protect the innocent and punish the guilty for years to come. 6 months later, Captain Sarah Torres stood before Congress, delivering testimony that would reshape military justice forever. The hearing room was packed with families of the 47 vindicated victims, media representatives, and military officials who had come to witness the final chapter of the largest corruption scandal in modern military history. Colonel Vincent Kruger and 16 co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 25 years to life imprisonment. Their network of manufactured evidence and false prosecutions had finally been dismantled through the courage of one woman who refused to accept injustice. Elena's back tattoo, revealed during a medical examination that confirmed her true identity, displayed the names of fallen comrades from her Ranger unit. Each name represented a promise kept and honor restored through her 3-year undercover investigation. General Williams promoted Torres to major and assigned her to lead the newly created Military Justice Reform Division. Her first initiative established independent oversight for all court-martial proceedings, ensuring no soldier would ever again face the corruption that had destroyed so many lives. The military police students from Fort Gordon requested Torres as their graduation speaker the following year. Standing before the new formation, she spoke simply about the power of truth over convenience, courage over compliance, and justice over politics. Private Elena Martinez had died at Fort Gordon, but Captain Sarah Torres emerged stronger, vindicated, and committed to ensuring that truth would always triumph over corruption. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.